Leadership Thread with Dr. Peggy Pelonis. And now, Dr. Peggy Pelonis.
Welcome back to the Leadership Thread. Today with us is Dr. Adela Gondek. I'm so excited to have her with us from Columbia University and looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Adela. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. I want to say just a couple of things before, and I'm going to actually read some of them because I want to get them right. You're actually a lecturer. You teach in public and environmental sustainability ethics at Columbia University. You're a political scientist, however, by training with specialization in political theory. You did all the right things. You went to, of course, Harvard University, Kennedy School, combined law with environmental studies. And you have prior experience as a legislative analyst in the Massachusetts State Senate, working on consumer product safety, prison reform, and model judicial practice. That's wow. You're also an author. And among other things, you also write poetry, among them the Poems of Enlightenment. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us today. What I'm really interested in is your story, how you got to be where you are today. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about teaching ethics, because that's so important, particularly today when so many things are coming into question. Can you tell me about how you came to be interested in doing that?
Yes, certainly. I'm very happy to tell you about that. And you're absolutely right. I was a Ph.D. in ethics, actually more political philosophy with ethics and so on, but it was quite theoretical. And I went into the work world, and that's what I was teaching, especially political science and so on. And my husband and I came sort of like into the arena of Columbia University, and I was asked to teach courses in the political science department, which is obvious, and so on. And I taught courses on justice in American political theory and things like that. Mainly, though, it was theory. And then one of the deans of the School of Public Affairs and so on asked me if I would teach a practitioner viewpoint ethics and so on. So I said, well, okay, I'll give it a try, and so on. But it wasn't too difficult because I had been working as a legislative analyst and so on. So I was very, very familiar with the kinds of issues that come up, and also just the sort of protocols and so on that you have to maintain when you are in the halls of government and so on. And so I worked on that and created a syllabus, and that one was the syllabus that was the Executive Master of Public Administration. And that one was about leadership and management and so on, ethics of leadership and management. And so then a few years passed, and the same dean, he said he wanted to launch an environmental studies program, and would I do ethics of the environmental movement and so on. And I said, well, I think I can do that, but I need a little time to write another syllabus and so on. So I launched that as well. So I was then teaching the public ethics as well as the environmental ethics. And that's rather unusual because people who are specialized in public ethics and public affairs are different from the people who are doing the environmental issues and so on. But I had said I would give it a try, and so I was sort of like a two-sided person. And then actually, he also launched another course and program, and that was in the School of Public of Professional Studies. And so I did launch another course for him for this too. It was getting pretty complicated and so on. So by that point, I had to sort of be moved be moved from political science to the other two schools and so on. And
So a lot of firsts. You started a lot of things in the school, but the main denominator was always ethics. And here's my
Right.
question.
yes,
I know you teach about ethics, and people come and they learn about ethics, but is ethics actually something that can be taught to, in practical ways? You know what I mean? And what age do you think that needs to take place, if so?
well, I do think that it begins with childhood.
Yeah.
And nowadays, a lot of psychologists say it begins in utero, even. Like a uterus in a baby might be very frightened by loud sounds in the latter portions of pregnancy and so on, because those are instinctive sort of reactions.
Right,
They don't,
yeah.
and we don't what that means, but it is often associated with falling and crashing and so on.
We don't know what that means because, in utero, the baby can't tell us
Right.
what their interpretation. But in reality, up until the age of 7, where children, haven't yet formed their logical mind and are able to discern between right and wrong, or between what's absolute or not, we make interpretations at that young age, and it's usually centered around us and how we perceive things to be. And those interpretations about life follow us the rest of our lives.
That's
So
right.
you're absolutely right. In childhood, many things can take place, but how you, as an individual, interpret those is very important.
Yes, it's very interesting, and I do think it's a little peculiar because I did have a very peaceful family, but when I was a little child, I didn't really think of that as being unusual. You just take it for granted.
Yeah, that's what life is.
Yes,
Right.
and so I don't know what a child that is in a family that is very rough, maybe they think that's normal. So who knows,
or children who grew up
Right.
in war-stricken areas or poverty or
Right.
whatnot. Yeah.
And so it was really, like I say, peaceful, but as I have grown older and older, I have seen actually that wasn't normal, that in a lot of families there's a lot of turmoil and difficulties and so on. And so, and at the same time, that sort of family that I was lucky to have, I think it gives you strength through the rest of your life. Because, you might have a peaceful family, but then you might have a family that is turmoil, depending upon the marriage or whatever it is, but you still have remnants of what it was like, and it gives you a lot of strength going through what you might be going through, and so on. So it's really interesting because I think sometimes people feel like, I can't even remember my childhood or something like
Yeah.
that. But actually, you really are carrying that along.
Unconsciously,
yes,
you are.
exactly.
But you mentioned, you described your childhood as being very peaceful, which is, you didn't say it was a happy childhood. It was you used the word peaceful. So that's important to you in some way. Tell me more about that.
Well, I can truly say, and I've thought about this, that I never ever in my whole life ever heard my parents angry at each other. Or yelling at each other,
Yeah.
or anything. They just seemed to, in a normal way, sort of go about the days and so on, and so forth. And they were just pleasant people. And then I think sad sometimes because I feel like a lot of people don't have that experience. And it doesn't have to be wealth, and it doesn't have to be, that everyone I'm like, look at me type of thing. It was just, like I say, peaceful, and it has stayed with me, throughout my whole life.
So if life was so peaceful, okay, what happened in life when challenges came your way? How did you learn to resolve that, cope with that? How did you respond to that?
Well, I think because I thought I used the word peaceful, it gives you almost a Socratic sort of part of your brain or something that what you are doing is sort of like thinking instead of reacting immediately in situations and challenges and so on. And you sort of step out of that moment a little bit and you think, how can I handle this, and so on. Yeah. And I think that really is an important part of psychology and
very important.
And so on.
Because if you could step out of that emotion, and it helps you to think of the solutions, right. Whereas when we're emotional, we can't see them many times. Let's go back to the idea of ethics. Yes. And you're really passionate about teaching this, particularly in the business world. And how did that come about? In teaching it, or yes, it's difficult. It really is difficult because a lot of it is negative, and you like to sort of teach the students that these are sort of like good positions, positive positions in life, and so on. But now we have to sort of like look at what is out there. And you find a lot that is very, very tough, and so on. Behavior in business and behavior even in nonprofits and governmental agencies and so on. You can hear a lot of what we call bad behavior. Yeah. And it doesn't have any one definition, but basically it could mean that there's a whole lot of sexual harassment, or there can be a lot of just throwing furniture around committee rooms or something. So violence, and sexual issues and so on. You find all of these things going on, even in the CEO. And so I just tell my students in the end of the course, think of two things: honesty and modesty. And if you want to run for office, believe me, they will dig up if you're not honest and modest when you are even 12 years old or whatever. So you might, learn a lot of things, a lot of leadership ideas and so on. But those two things are very, very important, especially nowadays when there's a lot of documentation of whatever you do at any time. And it's easier if you're like for running for office or anything like that to look up all this and look up this, and immediately it's on the front page and so on, and so on. But of course, people, we want people to make the right choices. We want to be able to make the right choices. But it's one thing to be able to act ethically because you're afraid. Mm-hmm. It's another thing for that to be instilled in you as it was in your childhood. Trying to do, obviously people will make mistakes, but, it's one thing having a mindset of ethical behavior. And that's the piece that's challenging, I think, many times to teach if it's not ingrained by the environment that we, grow up in. So going back to your childhood, you mentioned who was the dominant role model in your life? Who did you look up to? To say,
yes, that's a wonderful question. And I respected my parents a lot, and so on. And they were sort of typical roles. And he was an officer, and my mother was a mother, and so on, and but they did great jobs at what they were doing, and so on. And I can always remember how busy they always were, and so on. And that also made it sort of peaceful because, well, my sister was a beautiful dancer and everything, and my mother handmade all of her costumes with beads and sequins and everything. And just seeing people do that kind of intensive work is very, very sort of awesome. And my father, on the other hand, it was in the days of NATO for Izmir, for Turkey, and also for Greece. And so we were abroad a lot of the time, and he had to have a lot of patience and everything, and a lot of sort of strength and so on, because there was also the Soviet Union and so on, and there were a lot of difficulties with that he had to figure out. And sometimes when we were abroad, he would fly back to the U.S. because he would have to go to congressional meetings and so on, like what do you think the budget for this should be, and so on. Then he would fly back, and but I do think when he was young, maybe like in his 20th years, I think that that was in World War II. Once I asked him when I was only in first and second grade, I said, "Dad, what is war like?" And he, which he didn't use this language, he said, "Hell," and then he dropped the subject. But then many years went by, and I was a legislative analyst, and I was doing some constituency work, and I called up the state level Veterans Administration and so on, and I said, this is a person who needs some help and so on with vision or something as a result of the Vietnam War and so on. And so the person in the office picked up the phone saying, "And who are you?" I said, "I'm Adela Gondek in this office," and that person said, "That's the only Gondek I've ever known in my life, the only one besides now you." And he said, "Is it related to you?" I said, "Well, if you've been in the Pacific Theater, so was my father in the Pacific Theater when he was only about 28 or so." And he said he was the greatest officer I have ever seen or worked under.
What made him great,
and
yes, according to this person?
That's exactly. I said, well, how? And so on. And he said 3 things. He said he always went in the direction of cover with his soldiers. And then he said he also turned around and counted them. And then he always went first. And then I thought, oh my gosh, my father never said all of that to me. And it was just by totally luck that I heard this man that wanted to express himself. And I thought, well, I'm not a soldier, and I really don't know what it's like, but it made me feel very proud of what, he was even at that young age, like 27 or 28. So that was always a very important thing, but it came into my life when I was about 21 in the office and so on. So that's another way in which, things follow you.
Yeah, and in, your dad working for NATO and in times of war and so on and so forth, but somehow he conveyed, these are ethical principles,
Right.
Take cover, always be first,
Yes,
when you're leading, and make sure that you're counting everyone, make sure nobody stays behind. These are indeed ethical principles. So obviously those were conveyed somehow, some way in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what role did Mom play in all this?
Well, I can tell you this. This was a very sort of, it sounds peaceful, and I use that word, but because of the Soviet system and so on, we were always moving. And so she was the one that had to sort of like keep life going in a healthy way and a logical way and so on, with taking the children here and there and so on, because I was actually born in Kentucky, in Fort Knox, and immediately we were on our way to Izmir. And we lived there for quite a few years because of the NATO process and so on. So he was watching that. And I could always see that it was the CIA and things like that were in the air too all the time, because they even the officers would call the floor they were on the Tamion building in Athens, they would say that's where the spooks are and so on. You can't go up there, and so on. But yes, so she was the one that was always packing and unpacking and packing and unpacking. And she had not gone to college. She had also been a dancer and a singer, which is one way that women got anywhere in the 1940s and things like that. And so then she was just sort of always the helping hand and everything.
But a very stable force in your life. Exactly. She kept things going, but it was also a very stable force.
Yes, but she also had to be very brave, too, because, for example, when we lived in Turkey, my father had a translator and went to the mountains for the whole week. Yeah. And so we just had to stay there, and we were just little small children. We stayed with her alone and so on. And she always had to wait, get him to come home, on the weekend, but then he would have to go again. So everything was sort of like I think some people, when I came out of all of that, I talked to people that lived in a sort of typical suburban life, and I said, like, what is that like? Because it was just, you mean you lived here all this time in the same house with the driveway and everything? And I thought, like, gee, was I missing something? But, I didn't really think negative about it. I just thought, well, that was my life as a child.
You were actually born in this country, but your family immigrated to the United States, so that was a big move.
Well, right. Well, I was born here and everything, and we went to Izmir and so on. And then we came back, and then what happened then was that he was sent to Korea, and he didn't have to fight there, but he did have to be a peacekeeper. And so on in the area between North Korea and South Korea, and which is still there, and so on. And then he came back, and then he had orders to go to Greece, so we were going there, and so on. And through all of that period of change and so on, it took us, really, my sister and me, and we were just basically all over the place until we finally were going to college. And that was the first place where we stayed put, and so on.
Do you remember a time that stands out for you when life got particularly challenging and how you coped with that? Like all these changes, moving around, the stories of war, all of these things. Anything that stands out for you at a younger age?
Well, it's an interesting thing that I would say that one of the things that I had to manage somehow was that when I came back from Greece and so on, I went only into 11th grade because I had been in the other 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and so on. And I felt that it was so inadequate. Because I already had done a lot of those courses in Greece for some reason. Maybe it was just had a different sort of way of aligning courses and so on. And then I got the idea, which was very unusual then, to say, like, maybe I can just go to college right away and skip the 12th grade. And so my parents said, well, why don't you give it a try, if you want to? And I did all the reading and everything, like, for SATs and things like that. And I filled out all the forms, and only school for women would accept me for some reason. But and even so, I got letters back that said, we want you to come, but you have to finish 12th grade. And the only one was Goucher College, which is in Maryland. And they said they were sort of a little bit more they would try something different. And they called me for an interview. And they said, well, we'll give you a try. And they said, they said, if you can't get through the first year of college, you have to go back
and do 12th grade.
Yes, I know. And yes, so it was fine. It was really
fine.
It. I did.
And so that challenge was
a success. And then and then I was doing the courses, and I kept taking an extra one and everything. So I ended up being 19 years old when I was graduating. And everybody told me, you're really peculiar. And I said, well, not too peculiar, it just worked this way, on timelines and so on. And so that was when I got my job. And I said, I don't think I want to go to grad school yet. I want to get a little bit more knowledgeable of the world and so on, that the work world, And I did do that. And then when I got into Harvard, I was very happy, but I kept my job. And so on. And sometimes that was a little bit, yes, and sometimes that was a little challenging too, because I loved my job and I loved going to Harvard courses and so on, but they would look at me sometimes a little bit like, why are you doing a job? It's interesting because now it is the best thing. The students now that are getting a master's
can do it all.
They want to have an internship or something, and it's a big deal if they get one. But in those days, it was more like, why aren't you just being, a PhD?
One thing,
yes,
and doing a candidate. Just one final thing before we end. I wanted you to say a few things about the climate school. And the things that you're teaching there in relation, of course, to ethics and environmental sustainability. But what's one thing that you would want to leave us with in relation to climate?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be aware of it, and that's very, very important. And then, obviously, we need to be doing something, whether it's a small project or something more, very significant and so on. It's difficult to say exactly what to do because it's so diverse. And in different states even, and different countries and so on, there are very different kinds of projects. And a lot of the things are not accessible to just the typical person. Like you might be doing, sort of like changing the coastline or something like that. And in that case, you probably do have to be, belonging to a company and a nonprofit and so on, and make a deal of some kind of who is going to profit this or whatever. So a lot of those things, are a little out of reach for the average person. But I do think one of the most important thing that has happened is the teaching of it, and so on.
But do you think that the average person can make a difference?
Yes.
When you have all these conglomerates
absolutely.
That are,
And I do think that the children grow up, and now my students typically have degrees like or a BA or a BS or something like that in ecology and ecosystems. But when I first started teaching, maybe 20 years ago, no one had those in their departments yet. They would say, and I would say, what was your major? And they would say biology or chemistry. But now it is much more, earth studies or ecology. And so on. So that's a huge change, and so on. And when you have them for these degrees and so on, students for these degrees, they're very fast learners because they have that foundation. But I do think also the little children they come in and they sort of know what an ecosystem is, even though they don't know exactly how they work and so on. So I think that those things are the most critical things. And unfortunately, this is not true in the world necessarily, that some don't have those kinds of things. And on the other hand, the country that is really ahead is Costa Rica. And it's just amazing because they regard themselves sort of as part of the rainforest and the Amazon steps to it and so on. And they have actually incorporated it from kindergarten just like in a country, they might teach you your country's constitution. Like in the U.S., you teach kindergartners about turkeys or something.
Yes.
I mean, not the country, but the birds.
Yeah, I completely agree that education and starting early is very, very important. And I'm reminded of a colleague whose first grader little girl went home and said to her, "Mom, what are you doing about the SDGs?" And she was just so delighted to hear that in first grade her daughter was aware of some of the things going on in the world.
Absolutely. So much of it is about education, I think.
I think that's crucial.
And then you can think of little projects for the household and so on. You can do that.
Yeah,
you
can.
It's really amazing. And some hotels and things even here, like I think the Waldorf or one of them, they had like a roof, a garden on the roof for vegetables or something, or parsley and things, herbs and things like that. So there's a lot. We
both agree that education is the way to go, and starting early with the young ones, and especially in teaching ethics and sustainability. I really thank you for sharing your story with us and helping us unravel a little bit of that thread and how you got where you are today. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And thank you once again for joining us on the Leadership Thread, Education, Ethics, and Sustainability. Thank you.